So, hello again, everybody. Today, tackling another question from social media, which is what are my preferred or favorite things to offer to the good people? I'm pretty straightforward with this for what I actually offer myself at home. I tend to mostly stick with cream, butter, milk, occasionally honey, sometimes candy, and I will on occasion offer whatever I happen to personally be eating, or whatever I have on hand, share a meal, that kind of thing. I have, under very specific circumstances, offered other things. Clean water is a big one. Fruit, particularly apples, those get offered on a not irregular basis. And under very particular circumstances, usually sort of emergency circumstances or very specific occasions with not deities, well, maybe deities, but the fair folk that I have a strong connection to, that I sort of have alliances with, I have on occasion offered blood. I don't particularly tend to recommend that, especially if you're not sure why that might not be a bad idea, or why that might not be a good idea. Sorry, why that might be a bad idea. My brain kind of crossed those two there. If you don't know why it's not a good idea to offer blood, or specifically situations where you wouldn't want to do that, or beings that you definitely would not want to do that to, then I don't recommend doing it at all. But there are certain situations where I have done that, and it is a very situational kind of thing. So those are sort of where I'm at with offerings. When we look at what is traditional for offerings, we're really looking at any kind of dairy product is going to be a go-to. Cream, milk, butter, really any dairy product is a good one. Bread, any baked goods, any kind of bread really. I would also sort of put cake in that. I have a particular type of honey cake that I offer on the holy days as well. The recipe actually came to me in a dream. I have it up on my blog if anyone's curious about that, but it's literally just some oat flour, eggs, and honey. That's all that's in it, and then you cook it, and then I offer that on very specific holy days. So when we're looking at like super traditional offerings, you really are going to be looking at dairy products, some baked goods. If we look outside of Irish culture, which is where I'm focusing here, Germanic tradition, we do see offerings of specifically meat, red meat. We also see that actually in some of the Celtic, particularly in Brittany and France, the idea of them liking red meat and cows. We also see in the Norse some other things, although butter and cream, again, are pretty consistent across all of this. When I was in Iceland recently in September, I found that they were very receptive to eggs as offerings. I don't know that there's really any folklore behind that. It was more of a personal gnosis thing, but I did find it really effective. So I'll sort of put that out there. From other sort of more modern gnosis perspectives, a lot of people I know offer honey, and I found that honey is really well received. People in general seem to find that sweet things are really well received. That is a very modern thing to offer. Traditionally, as I've said, we're looking at dairy products, we're looking at baked goods, things along those lines are what we see historically and in folklore being offered. There's also some evidence in the Irish material, again, of the idea of offering clean water or leaving clean water out for them, whether you want to really look at that as an offering or not. So that is something that I do myself as well. there is a lot to back up the idea that they do want or enjoy clean water. We do also know from other folklore that they find dirty water offensive, so it sort of makes sense that they would want clean water. There's different theories on why exactly they want the clean water. They don't necessarily drink it or use it for that purpose, but they do like it, so that is an option. That is actually the main thing that I recommend people do if you're going to a sacred site or an archaeological site or any sort of public location or privately owned, well-known location that's associated with themselves, and you want to give some kind of offering. Really, your best option is water, just clean, pure water. It's not going to mess up the site. It's not going to cause any issues with local wildlife. You don't have to worry about it causing problems with the potential archaeology there. Just clean, pure water. Always a good go-to. And I've never had issues offering that. Since we're talking about offering, I do want to talk a little about why we make offerings to the good people, to the fairies, because this is a topic that I find causes a lot of confusion. They aren't deities or gods by most people's standards. It can be a little bit of a gray area, particularly when we get into the fairy kings and queens, some of whom are gods. We know that for a fact. But putting that aside, we do have a long-standing tradition in folklore and in stories of making offerings to the good people. So why do we do this? There's a couple trains of thought. One, which is the one that I find modern Americans in particular can have the most problem with, is simply that we make offerings, we give them things, almost like a protection payment sense. Sorry, I can't laugh. I can't not laugh when I say this, but it's almost like a protection payment. You're making the offering, you're giving them something of value, effectively so that they won't mess up your stuff, that they won't come in and cause problems or cause you problems, sort of getting ahead of any potential issues, if you will. So that's one school of thought. Another approach is that we make offerings in order to establish friendship with them, that we're trying to show them that we want to be on good terms with them. We want to have a peaceful relationship. We want to be their friends. That is particularly true, I think, of witches and pagans who want to connect to them in a spiritual sense, or perhaps want to deal with them in the more old, early modern witchcraft sense. So that would also apply. When we really look into the material, though, and particularly into the Irish culture, the big reason that we offer to the fairies is because they are owed a percentage of what we have. And this goes back, way back, if you will, to a particular story. I won't say the name in Irish, Old Irish, because then no one's going to understand it. But in English, the name of the story is The Taking of the Sidhe. And effectively, it's the story of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the Irish gods, have been defeated by the Gaels, the humans who have come to Ireland, and have been driven into the Sidhe, into the fairy hills. And when this happened, the Gaels took possession of Ireland, the surface of Ireland, and the gods went to live in the fairy mounds. But very quickly, the Gaels, the Maleesians, realized that their crops were not flourishing and their cows were not giving milk. This was obviously a significant problem for them. So they went to the Dagda, the Dagda being one of the major gods in among the Irish, the Tuatha Dé Danann. In fact, he was at this point the High King of the Tuatha Dé Danann. And so the Gaels went to him, and as the story goes, they made a friendship with him, made an alliance with him, and an agreement was struck that the Tajidanan would receive a tithe, a percentage of the harvest and of the milk. And in exchange, they would make sure the crops prospered and that the cows prospered and gave milk. So, this is sort of where we see the root of this idea. The Tajidanan, of course, are gods. But as time went on, they became not exactly members, but they came to be considered and counted among the Thena-Shi, the Aes-Shi, the people of the fairy hills, the people of the fairy mounds, because they were living in the Shi. And as more and more time went on, this idea that the fairy folk were owed a percentage of the harvest, we see sort of shifting from the gods, from the Tajidanan, to the fairies more generally. You will see some places that say all of the Tajidanan became the Aes-Shi, and therefore all of the Aes-Shi, all of the fairy folk are the Tajidanan. It's really not that simple. It's a lot more complicated than that. So we can't just say the old gods are now all the fairies and all the fairies were once gods. It's much more complex and layered than that. But we can say that this idea that all of the fairies are owed a percentage of the human harvest is probably rooted in this. I can't remember offhand the dating of that particular story, but it goes back to at least probably the 12th century, if I can remember that much correctly. And what we see later is that this idea becomes just sort of ubiquitous to the fairies. McNeill, in her book Festival of Lunasa, discusses the idea, which was widespread across Ireland in the early to mid 20th century, that a percentage of the best portion of the harvest every year was due or owed to the fair folk, and that they would take what was owed to them. And this is something that she collected in anecdotes from several different places. So we know that it was a fairly widespread belief at that time. We also see in evidence across various areas, Ireland and Scotland, something that's referred to by quite a few different authors, not just McNeill, the other McNeill, F. Marion McNeill, who wrote The Silver Bough. Let me see, Evan Wentz, I believe, mentions it in Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. It was discussed in various sources in Scotland and Ireland that the fairies were sort of owed a portion of things, and that they would also just flat out take or steal a portion of human crops or human food. It didn't always have to be crops like crops in the field. It could also literally be, the stock in a person's kitchen. There's at least one account of food that was cooking on a stove that they took. The term for it varies. I believe Reverend Kirk refers to it as the Torah. I might be mispronouncing it. It's Gaelic, which is not a language I'm super fluent in. But it's like the essence. Evan Wentz calls it the quintessence, the vital substance out of the food. So when they take this percentage, when they take this tithe, when you give them an offering and they take it, they're not taking the physical item. They're not taking the milk itself. They're not taking the cookie or the piece of bread. They're taking the vital substance out of it. They're taking what that sort of life-giving nutrient source, the quintessence, the vital substance. I'm probably not going to come up with a better word than we find from Reverend Kirk or Evan Wentz, quite frankly. But that's what they're taking. And what would happen is, if they were not being given what they were due, they would simply take it. So when we look at today and we look at the fact that obviously not as many people now give them offerings or, freely give them what they're owed. And we wonder, well, how do they feel about that? How does that work? Well, the simple answer is they're just taking what's due them, whether it's being given to them the way it's supposed to be or not, because that is how that works. I have a story which I tell often when I teach workshops and the subject of offerings comes up, because I sort of discourage people from starting to do regular offerings unless you're really committed to it, about how I had started giving milk as a regular offering once a week. My finances changed. I couldn't afford to do it anymore. I had skipped it 1 week. We came up to the second week, the day that I would normally have done it. And I had gone grocery shopping, coincidentally, that same day. I was coming to the house carrying a 2-gallon container of milk, which was more than I would normally have given them, at one time. And I was holding it, and I felt it physically being pulled from my hand. When it hit the grass at my feet, the entire container burst, and the milk just went everywhere and into the ground. And I strongly felt that was them taking what was owed to them, because I had made an agreement that I would give them a certain thing, and I was not doing that. So they simply took it. And since then I have held up my end of the deal, as it were. And I give them that offering every day, every week on a certain day. So that's one example. It was said that if you spoke badly of your own crops or your own produce of any sort, produce not necessarily meaning just like vegetable produce, but like any produce that you had, that would give them the right, if you will, the legal right to go in and take it, and that they would take entire fields worth of things when people did that. If you sort of spoke badly of your own possession, they would simply come in and take it away. So there's that aspect to it. We do also know from huge amounts of anecdotal evidence and folklore that there's a long-standing tradition of leaving particularly milk and cream offerings for different specific types of spirits. Most people are familiar with this with brownies, which are a type of household spirit, particularly seen in Scotland, in the lowlands and the highlands, that would be left a bowl of cream once a week, and would be known to do work around the house, the barn, the yard. In modern terms, we tend to think of them only as house spirits, but that's not really what brownies are. In the older folklore, they were more attached to an entire property, so they would help with harvesting crops, they would help with doing chores in the barn, and they would also help with things in the actual home itself, which are a little more complicated. Most modern fairy lore, if you're just looking at what you're going to find printed in like mass marketed books, is going to be sort of the highly simplified and condensed version, as compared to what we're going to find if you look at the older material. My point with all that, though, was just that the brownie would be left, very ceremonially left, a bowl of cream once a week in gratitude for what it would be doing around the home. There's a very specific approach to how that was done. It could not be done intentionally, which meant the housewife, who was generally the one doing it, couldn't make a big production, couldn't say that that's what she was doing, couldn't say it was for the brownie, but it was generally understood and accepted that that's what she was doing and that's who it was for. So it's an interesting process. And there are other spirits as well that we see this same concept of a specific weekly offering, particularly of milk, being done for. I'm just picking that example because it's one that a lot of people might already be familiar with. So when we look at offerings and why we're doing them, really that's what it comes down to. We are giving offerings because we've already sort of entered into this agreement in general as humans that we owe them a portion of our own harvest in order to keep the balance, if you will, that they help ensure that our crops grow, that our animals continue to produce for us, that the world, the agricultural world, stays in balance for us and provides for us, and in exchange, we give them a portion of what we harvest every year. Or they take it if we don't give it, because it is theirs by their judgment. So that is really the heart of why we do this. The friendship angle comes in more with spirits like the brownie, or house spirits. There's a practice with the Nisa or Tamta, Norse house spirits, where every year at Yule, on Mother Night, the solstice, the first night of Yule, you would leave out a bowl of porridge with a big pat of butter on top, which would be a gift to the house spirit to show it your appreciation for everything that it does in your household throughout the year. So that's another small example. So that would be another reason that we do the offering, and sort of the logic behind it. And then of course the idea that if you have spirits around that might potentially be troublesome, you want to give them some motivation to leave you alone. Obviously, if you're making offerings to them or giving them something that they might want, they're going to be less likely to randomly mess with you, hopefully, in theory. So that's why we do it. That's sort of my approach to how I do it. I generally have a small space set aside in my kitchen where I put offerings out. I do have an outdoor space as well. This is my backyard behind me, by the way. I do have a small outdoor space as well that I use in certain circumstances, but I generally leave things inside for the most part. I leave them out usually overnight, which is enough for that quintessence, that vital substance, to be taken as the offering. And then from my point of view, what's left is like an empty wrapper. There's nothing in it. So how you dispose of it after it's been offered is really up to you. You don't really have to treat it in a particular way, at least, from a fairy faith perspective. Traditionally, they would generally be left outside. It was perfectly fine if animals ate them. There are anecdotal references to them being eaten by animals, so that's fine. The thought was that there's no value to them, no vital substance left in them, so you don't want to be intentionally feeding them to anything on a regular basis. But it's perfectly fine if an animal eats it. You're not going to have any spiritual blowback from that. I have occasionally just thrown them away. That's also perfectly fine. It's an empty vessel at that point. It doesn't matter. And other than that, I think we've kind of covered every aspect of offering that I can think about at this point. I generally discourage offering, obviously, anything that has iron. There's also quite a few references in folklore, or really several references in folklore, to them not liking salt, and not eating any food that has salt in it. So I do avoid salted items. There are also a few references to them not liking meat, although as we did discuss, there are also places where it's considered traditional to offer them meat. I personally tend not to offer meat for the most part, just because the sorts of good folk that are going to be attracted to meat offerings are probably not the sort that I want hanging around. There's also, unless I'm specifically asked to give that sort of item, or unless I'm sharing a meal that happens to include meat in it, I just don't go out of my way to make meat offerings, eggs excluded. So that is everything I can think to mention about offerings to the good people. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. No, I did not mention alcoholic offerings. I'm sort of an agnostic on that topic. Believe it or not, there is really no folklore or anecdotal evidence for or against offering alcohol really for the most part. It's not something that we see mentioned. There's some mention of different sorts of fairies stealing alcohol, specifically breaking into things like wine cellars or breweries and stealing alcohol. So, I mean, obviously they do like it to a degree. I don't make a personal practice of offering alcohol, but I also do not drink alcohol myself. So it's not something I generally have on hand to be offering. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with pouring some out and leaving it on your altar. If you feel so inclined, just be aware that even though you will see people mentioning it and you know, it has become sort of modernly popular, there's not a ton of historical mention of that being done, at least that I've been able to find. Obviously, local practices will vary, family practices will vary, and all of that fun stuff. So, and this is starting to get a little long. I will wrap it up. Any questions, pop them in the comments. Hopefully this covered offerings pretty thoroughly, and I will see you in the next video. Have a good day.